A man walked into a high-end bank, his suit sharp, his posture relaxed but commanding. He didn't need to prove anything. He had walked into this bank countless times before. But today, something was different. He noticed it immediately. The way the manager's eyes scanned him, sizing him up like he didn't belong. The way the employees stiffened, hesitated, whispered. He had seen this before. And yet, he stayed calm. As he approached the front desk, a middle-aged manager in an expensive suit stepped forward. Fast. Too fast. Almost like he was in a hurry to stop him. The man barely opened his mouth to speak before the manager cut in. "Excuse me, sir. Are you lost?" The words were smooth, but the tone, cold, dismissive, condescending. A few customers glanced over. A couple of tellers paused their work. The man smiled slightly. He had been in this situation too many times before. "No," he said calmly. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The manager let out a dry chuckle. "Sir, maybe you didn't read the sign outside. This is a private bank. We only handle high-value clients." He didn't check his name. He didn't ask what he needed. He just assumed. But in just a few minutes, he would wish he had. Because the man standing in front of him wasn't just a client. He was the owner of the entire bank. And what was about to happen next would change everything. Have you ever been judged unfairly based on appearance? What would you do if this happened to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? Let us know below. The man's calm smile didn't fade, but the air in the room had shifted. The manager, still convinced he was right, placed both hands on the desk and let out another forced chuckle. "Sir, we're very busy today." His voice had a rehearsed politeness, but there was no real warmth behind it. The man didn't move. "Busy?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That's fine. I'll wait." A few customers looked over, sensing something was off. Some of the tellers exchanged quick, uncertain glances. The manager exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated. Instead of acknowledging the man's request, he reached for a clipboard and flipped through a few pages. "Before we go any further," he said, glancing up, "do you even have an account with us?" A couple of customers' heads turned slightly. The man's expression remained unreadable. "Do I have an account?" he echoed, as if tasting the words. The manager nodded impatiently. "Yes, sir. We have very exclusive clients here. If you don't have an account, I suggest trying one of the other banks downtown." He motioned toward the exit. For a brief moment, silence hung in the air. And then, the man slowly reached into his pocket. The manager stiffened slightly, his confidence faltering for the first time. Was he pulling out his ID? A business card? Maybe even a complaint letter? But when the man finally pulled his hand out, he wasn't holding any of those things. Instead, he placed a sleek black card onto the desk, sliding it toward the manager. The gold lettering gleamed under the lights. The manager's eyes flicked down, and his face froze, because this wasn't just any card. It was a VIP banking card, one reserved for only the most elite clients, the kind of card that only the wealthiest account holders received. The manager's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Cliffhanger. And before he could even think of what to say next, one of the tellers nearby suddenly gasped, recognizing the name on the card. Everything was about to change. The room fell silent as the VIP card sat between them, its gold lettering gleaming under the lights. A teller nearby covered her mouth, eyes wide as she recognized the name printed on it. She knew exactly who he was. But the bank manager, he was still clueless. Instead of taking a closer look, he brushed the card aside with his fingertips and scoffed. "Sir," he said, his tone dropping into something almost mocking, "anyone can get one of these fancy-looking cards. It doesn't mean you belong in here. A few employees shifted uncomfortably. The man, still calm, tilted his head slightly. "Oh? And what does belong here mean, exactly?" The manager chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "Let's just say we deal with serious wealth in this bank, not just people trying to look the part." The words hung in the air like a slap. Some of the other clients in the lobby turned fully now, sensing that this was no longer just a misunderstanding. It was disrespect. The teller, who had recognized the name, looked panicked. She knew the manager was digging his own grave, but he still wasn't done. With an exaggerated sigh, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if he was offering advice. "Look, sir, I don't want to waste your time. There are plenty of other banks that might suit your needs better. Why don't you try one of those?" He gestured toward the exit again. This time, the man's smile faded, not in anger, not in frustration, but in something much colder. Understanding. Understanding that this wasn't just ignorance, it was arrogance. And the manager was about to learn a very, very hard lesson. Cliffhanger. Before the man could even respond, the teller, who had been watching in horror, suddenly stepped forward, voice trembling. "Sir, do you even know who you're talking to?" The manager blinked, confused. And then, in that moment, everything began to unravel. The bank manager frowned, turning toward the teller who had just spoken. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice laced with irritation. The teller swallowed hard, glancing at the VIP card still sitting on the counter. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "Sir." She hesitated, then took a deep breath. This is Mr. Carter." The name sent a ripple through the employees nearby. A second teller, who had been silently watching, gasped audibly. The manager, however, still didn't get it. He rolled his eyes and crossed his arms. "And? What's your point?" The first teller looked at him in disbelief. "Mr. Carter owns this bank." Silence. The words hung in the air, sinking in slowly. The manager's smirk faltered. His eyes flicked back to the VIP card. For the first time, he actually looked at the name, and his face went pale. A few of the other employees took a step back, as if suddenly realizing they had been standing too close to something about to explode. Mr. Carter, the man he had mocked, dismissed, and insulted, was the CEO of the entire banking network. The manager's breath hitched, and he suddenly felt lightheaded. He had just tried to kick out his own boss. The realization hit him like a freight train. He stammered, his confidence crumbling. I didn't." But Mr. Carter remained still, his face unreadable. He let the moment stretch, let the weight of the truth sink in completely. Then finally, he spoke, calm, firm, and unwavering. "So, let me get this straight," he said, tilting his head slightly. "You refused to serve me. You assumed I didn't belong here. And now, you're speechless?" The manager opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Cliffhanger. The entire bank was frozen in silence, waiting to see what would happen next. And Mr. Carter? He wasn't done yet. The silence in the bank was suffocating. The manager stood frozen, his face pale, his confidence completely shattered. He opened his mouth, trying to come up with an excuse, anything to undo the disaster he had just created. But Mr. Carter didn't give him the chance. He slowly picked up the VIP card, sliding it back into his wallet. Then, in a voice that was calm but cutting, he spoke. "I walked into my own bank today, expecting to be treated like any other customer." His eyes locked onto the manager, but instead, I was met with disrespect, assumptions, and arrogance. The manager visibly swallowed, his hands starting to tremble. "Sir, he started, but Mr. Carter raised a hand, cutting him off. "Number, you had your chance to talk." The other employees stood frozen in place, watching as their manager's power crumbled before their eyes. Mr. Carter took a slow step forward. "Tell me something," he said. "Is this how you treat every customer who walks through that door?" The manager stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know who you were." Mr. Carter's expression didn't change. "And why should that matter?" The words hit like a slap. The manager's shoulders slumped. He had no answer. He knew the truth. If Mr. Carter had been any other customer, he would have never been given a chance. And that was unacceptable. Cliffhanger. Mr. Carter finally took a deep breath and looked around the room. "I think it's time we have a serious discussion about how this bank operates." The employees shifted nervously, because they all knew change was coming. And for the manager, his time was almost up. The tension in the room was thick. Every employee, every customer, even the security guard standing near the entrance, all eyes were on Mr. Carter. He looked around, letting the silence linger, letting everyone feel the weight of the moment. Finally, he spoke. "I think it's time we have a serious discussion about how this bank operates." The manager flinched at those words. He knew what was coming. Mr. Carter turned to the employees, his voice firm but even. "Has this happened before?" The tellers looked at each other, hesitant. One of them, a young woman who had recognized him earlier, took a shaky breath and nodded. "Yes, sir." Mr. Carter's jaw tightened. "And did anyone report it?" The employees shifted uncomfortably. Finally, another teller spoke up. "No one thought it would make a difference, sir." That hit hard, because if no one thought speaking up mattered, then that meant one thing. This problem ran deeper than just one arrogant manager. Mr. Carter let out a slow breath. "That ends today." The manager stiffened, realizing just how bad this was about to get. Cliffhanger. Mr. Carter turned his gaze back to him, his next words cutting through the air like a blade. "Now, let's talk about consequences." The manager's face turned pale, because he knew this wasn't just about an apology. This was about accountability, and he wasn't going to walk away from this unscathed. The manager felt his throat go dry. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him. Employees, customers, security, everyone was watching. Mr. Carter had given him the chance to explain himself. But what could he say? That he had made a mistake? That he didn't know who he was talking to? Would that have changed how he treated other customers before? Number. And now, it was time to face the consequences. Mr. Carter stepped forward, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "This isn't just about me," he said. "This is about the kind of business I refuse to run." The employees stood frozen, afraid of what would come next. Then, Mr. Carter turned toward the young teller who had spoken up earlier. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then answered. "Rebecca, sir." He nodded. "Rebecca, when you realized what was happening, you spoke up. That takes courage." Her eyes widened slightly. "We need more employees like you." The manager's jaw clenched. He knew what was coming, and he was right. Mr. Carter turned back to him, his expression unreadable. "As for you," he said slowly, "you've made it clear you don't belong in a leadership position." The manager's face drained of color. "Wait, sir, please. You embarrassed my company. You mistreated a customer. And worst of all, you thought you could get away with it." The manager tried to speak, but nothing came out. He could feel his power slipping away. "Clean out your office." The words hit like a hammer. A collective gasp rippled through the bank. The employees exchanged stunned glances. Some looked relieved. Others, like they had just witnessed justice in real time. The manager stood frozen, his world crashing down around him. And Mr. Carter, he wasn't done yet. Cliffhanger. He turned back to the rest of the staff, his voice firm. Now, let's talk about how we're going to fix this bank. The room stayed silent, because they all knew things were about to change for good. The room was still silent after Mr. Carter's words. The manager, humiliated and defeated, stumbled backward, his world crashing down. But Mr. Carter, he had no time for pity. He turned back to the employees, his gaze sweeping across the room. Now, let's talk about how we're going to fix this bank. The tellers and staff stood frozen, unsure if they should speak. Some had worked there for years, watching mistakes, staying quiet, afraid to speak up. But not anymore. Rebecca, the young teller who had spoken earlier, hesitated before raising her hand. "Sir, I've seen things like this happen before." Mr. Carter nodded. "Go on." She swallowed. "Not just with customers, with employees too. Some of us get overlooked, ignored. Promotions go to the same people and we don't feel heard." A few other employees nodded in agreement. Mr. Carter took a slow breath. "That changes today." He glanced toward one of the senior executives standing near the back of the room, who had remained quiet this whole time. "Effective immediately, we're revising our employee training. And not just for customer service, but for leadership, inclusion, and fair treatment." The executives stiffened. Some looked relieved. Others looked like they'd just realized their jobs might be at risk, too. Then Mr. Carter turned back to the staff. "And promotions?" He paused, scanning their faces. "They won't be based on favoritism anymore. They'll be based on performance, hard work, integrity." A few tellers exchanged hopeful glances. The atmosphere in the room was shifting. A workplace built on fear and unfair treatment was now turning into something else. A place where people were valued. A place where change was finally happening. Cliffhanger. Mr. Carter folded his arms, his voice strong. "This is just the beginning." And from the way the staff looked at him, they believed it. The weight of change hung in the air. Employees exchanged glances, some hopeful, some hesitant. They had just witnessed the fall of a toxic leader. But now they were looking at a future they had never imagined possible. Mr. Carter stood at the center of it all, his presence commanding but calm. "This is just the beginning." The room remained silent, waiting for what he would say next. Then, in a move that caught everyone off guard, he smiled. "I know what it's like to work in a place where you feel invisible." His voice was softer now, more personal. "Where you feel like no matter how hard you try, no one sees your effort." A few tellers nodded slowly. They knew exactly what he meant. "But I built this company because I believe in something different." He turned, his gaze locking onto each employee. "Starting today, this bank isn't just about numbers. It's about people." One of the senior executives cleared his throat. "Sir, if I may ask, what happens now?" Mr. Carter didn't hesitate. "We rebuild." The executive nodded slowly, as if processing the words. Mr. Carter continued. "We implement leadership training. We restructure promotions. We ensure that this bank represents fairness, respect, and excellence. And anyone who refuses to follow that?" His smile faded. "They don't belong here." A quiet energy rippled through the room. Employees exchanged hopeful glances, the idea that things might actually change. It was starting to feel real. Rebecca, the young teller who had spoken up earlier, raised her hand. "Sir," she asked, "what about new leadership? Who's going to replace the manager?" Mr. Carter glanced at her, and then he did something no one expected. Cliffhanger. He looked Rebecca right in the eye and said, "How would you like to step up?" The room erupted in whispers, because in that moment it was clear this wasn't just talk. This was a new beginning. The whispers filled the room as every employee turned toward Rebecca. She sat frozen, stunned, her eyes wide as Mr. Carter's words sank in. "Me?" she asked, almost in disbelief. Mr. Carter nodded, his gaze steady. "You spoke up when no one else did. That takes courage. And courage is exactly what we need in leadership." The room fell silent again. Some employees exchanged glances, others nodded in quiet approval. Rebecca swallowed hard. I don't know what to say." Mr. Carter smiled. "Say yes." She took a deep breath. And then she lifted her chin and nodded. "Yes." A soft ripple of applause broke out among the staff. It wasn't just about Rebecca. It was about what she represented. A fresh start, a real change, a bank that finally valued its people. Mr. Carter turned back to the staff, his voice strong but welcoming. "This isn't just about one promotion. It's about a shift in how we operate. This bank will be known for integrity, respect, and leadership. And I expect each and every one of you to hold yourselves and each other accountable to that standard." The employees nodded, the energy in the room completely different from when this all began. The manager, who had once ruled with arrogance, gone. The fear and unfairness that had loomed over the workplace, fading. This was a new era. As Mr. Carter turned to leave, he glanced one last time at the team. "Now, let's get to work." And with that, the bank's real transformation began. At the start of this story, a bad leader believed his power made him untouchable. But in the end, true leadership isn't about power, it's about integrity. Rebecca proved that one voice can make a difference. Mr. Carter showed that real leaders lift others up. And the manager, he learned the hard way that arrogance has consequences.